Hey guys, Kobani here with another video, and for this video I'll be using it to launch off a new tutorial series that I'm planning on doing, where I show you guys my workflow for a specific asset from concept to the final render. And today's asset is going to be fairly simple. It's going to be a stylized shield, so we'll be working together from concept all the way to the final render, as I said earlier. And I'll do a voiceover over my recordings, because while I draw or model, sometimes I tend to go silent, so it's easier to do a voiceover after I've recorded the video. So for this one, we'll be starting with the concept art in Photoshop. You can use any software you want to create your concept art, or you could find some concepts online. When creating concepts or using other concepts, it's best to do more research on the theme you are going for. And this theme, I wanted fantasy and I wanted it to be a shield. So for this one, I researched a lot of shields, like what kinds of shields were used in what areas, and why the shields were designed in a specific way. And as you can see over here, I have two shields right now. The one on the left would be used by someone who might be a lancer. They can rest their lance on top of the gun, top of the shield. And the buckle shield, it could be any kind of shield, which is the one in the middle right now. It can be used in lots of situations where, depending on the size, foot soldiers can use it, or people who are part of the front line and have to take the first wave. So it all depends on what era you're going for, or what kind of war you imagine the characters using it, and also what race and other stuff. So it comes down to some research. So I was exploring the silhouette of the shield first, because I wanted to see what silhouette I was going for. So I just drew some rough concepts, and usually when I draw like that, I create a layer and then I hide that layer, and then I go to another layer and keep on going, so I don't delete the layers in case I want to go back. And for this one, I explored a more extreme fantasy shield, where I went for an animal head at the front of the shield to see if I wanted it. Like it's used a lot in World of Warcraft. In reality, a shield like that will be a little bit impractical, because the weight will be in a weird way, and with the character walking around with a shield like that, they may be at a disadvantage. But also, if it's fantasy and the characters have like absurd amounts of strength, or they fight in different fighting styles, they can move around with shields like this and no one will question it, because when it comes to fantasy, you are free to explore. So I just wanted to test it out here, but it wasn't fitting the theme of an anti-magic shield that I wanted to go for, so I scratched it. Since I'm recording over, I have to wait a little bit for my video to catch up sometimes. I sped up the video a little bit, so this is not me drawing in real time. So I think this is when I did the final concept, where I loosened my hands a little bit. So I just went ahead and I drew the shield that you see in the final. You can download the images off of my ArtStation, because I tend to put everything on ArtStation, but obviously you can use it for any commercial purposes and stuff. But if you want to use a concept for anything, you can use it, I don't mind. And I think at first I explored how I wanted a crystal to look, because I wanted a crystal in the middle of my shield. I wanted that crystal to represent the anti-magic nature of the shield. So I took some liberties and went online to find some references for how some rocks look, especially when they are in the form of a crystal, and what makes it look like a crystal, basically. So I just decided to do some rough drawings. And usually when I know I'm going to sculpt something, I like to draw it first, because I find it easier to draw before I sculpt, and it basically loosens me up for the sculpting itself, because like I feel like sculpting is just like an advanced step when for drawing. So if you're comfortable drawing, you find yourself being comfortable with sculpting in your 3D softwares. Now this is when I say sculpting, I'm referencing to 3D sculpting and not traditional hand sculpting. So for this one also, you tested this crystal on top of a shield silhouette, because when it comes to a shield, the most important thing is a silhouette of a shield. Because if somebody were to give you a round shield, you probably assume it's a ninth shield, and if they were to give you a kite shaped shield, you could assume it's a ninth shield. So most of the time, a silhouette of a shield can tell you what time or era it was being used in, and that alone can be enough. And when people can tell something off from first seeing it before they actually go and look at the details, you've done your job right. So over here, I also came up with the idea of at first I wanted one large crystal in the middle, but then as I was drawing, I decided to add some other crystals. So it looks like those crystals are basically also supporting that large crystal. And I went with a set number of only 3 extra crystals, so that I don't overwhelm the front of the shield with too much details. So moving on from here, this one I decided that okay, I liked this crystal, but I wanted to explore more. And I think the next concept was my final. Usually for concept art, people go through lots of iterations, but I didn't want this video to be, I didn't want to spend too much time on this concept art, because I already had exactly what I wanted in my head, but I needed to draw it out. Like I had the theme, so, and since I was the one telling myself, and it wasn't like I'm doing this for somebody else, it's easier for me to change my mind during the modeling phase. But doing the concept art first mostly helps with planning your block out, which is very important to do before going to ZBrush. This workflow also, you don't have to use this exact workflow for stylized assets. Some people have a workflow where they model everything and they model it at very low res and jump straight to texturing. But with this workflow that I'm doing, where I model the block out and sculpt on it, I usually do this when it has an organic shape that I want to have more control over it, because when it comes to modeling, you have less control over it. You can still achieve organic modeling, but it's just that it's less tedious when it comes to sculpting, because with sculpting I feel more freedom, but the disadvantage being when you sculpt, you have to optimize your mesh and bring it back down to the game res. But if you are used to it and you don't mind, it usually doesn't create a bother. So right here is when I came up with a final, and I had the crystal basically lined up the way I wanted it to be, and I moved on to adding some other details that I came up with while I was drawing the crystal, because I wanted to show how the crystal is incorporated into whatever material it was on. Because at this phase I didn't know what materials I wanted yet. I just knew the crystal, but I didn't know the other materials that would be surrounding it yet. But that's why it's good to start with the concept or some research. So at this point, I'll just skip to the final, because I just drew some stuff around, and you might see me like pause in the video itself, because I was actually talking while recording it, but I decided later on to cut off that part and record over it. So that's why sometimes you see me pause while drawing. So I'll be skipping over to the final part, and then we'll be moving on to the block out. Okay, so for this next part, I had set up the concept and everything, so I have basically a set of materials planned. So I have the crystal metal, and initially I planned on the middle part being a special kind of metal, but as you can see in the final texture I changed my mind, and since it's my own concept and I was exploring, I decided to make sure to give myself a little bit more freedom. And after the concept, we'll be moving on to the block out in Maya. And in the block out phase, that's where a lot of the project starts coming together, because if you spend more time blocking out, you kind of set yourself up for an easier life as you move on to the next phases, which is sculpting or texturing, depending on what workflow you're using. So if you want to just move from block out to texture, whereas you just make a block out, you're not probably very good. So now in Maya, And forgive me, the video is too quick, but I had to really bring this video down. So in Maya, I import the image plane the way you do it anyway, and I used a cylinder. I used a 16-sided cylinder for the blockout, and basically I just used it to get the shape of the shield, and I moved on to defining every little shape in there. Whereas for the blockout, make sure you get your main shapes, and don't worry about merging vertices and all that stuff. It doesn't matter if your meshes are intersecting or anything, because in the end, with stylized hand painted textures, you can fake a lot of details with the hand painting. So we just, what I just did was that I extruded in a face to get a little line around the shield, so that it's not like the transition from the metal plate outside to the inside is smooth. That's not what I want. I wanted there to be like a line, an obvious line separating both of those materials. And as you see in the blockout, I explored 2 different designs, and ultimately I end up using only one design. At first I was planning on using a sphere for the crystal, as you can see, but I decided that would be too much, so I took a cube. Usually when you smooth a cube, it turns into a sphere, but because of how the how low poly the cube is, that sphere will be different. So basically I decided to use that for the crystal instead, and I just basically extruded it out. And you see me go into 3 mode a lot, because I like to go into the 3 mode, so it gives me an idea of how when I subdivide in ZBrush it will look. And from here on out, all I do is just add a couple of holding edges so I can keep my shapes like that, and just like that we have the blockouts of the crystal. And even from here on out, I could have just moved on to texturing right here. Like, if I could have basically done like one subdivision on the crystal and reduced it a little bit more, and I could have used the shield that I have right now and gone to the texturing software I want to use, and basically texture from there, because hand painted textures really work well when it's very low poly, and you basically use the hand painting to fake a lot of high poly details. But I wanted to sculpt, because I use the sculpt almost like a sketching phase for that before I actually paint the textures, so I can use the sculpt to explore some different designs and not have to worry about the colors and stuff. But it all comes down to what you want to do. So in the blockout also, I plan on adding this sphere shape for the middle part. I wanted the middle part to be a little bit larger than it was in the concept, but ultimately after exploring this idea for a while, I realized it wasn't looking right, because it made the shield look too heavy than I actually wanted it to be. So I just scrapped it. But since I did it all in the blockout phase, I didn't lose that much. It's good to take your time and explore anything you want. Also, one disadvantage of going to the sculpting phase is that most of the time you have to add holding edges, and as you can see, I'll be doing so right here. If you find yourself not wanting to add the holding edges, because when you add holding edges to a blockout, it's hard to use the blockout as your low poly later on. So basically what you can do is basically duplicate the blockout and then add a low poly to that one and save it out as a basically the one that will go to Maya, and the blockout to be safe. Not Maya, I mean ZBrush. But for this one I didn't do that, because I planned on retopologizing the sculpt. If you plan on retopologizing your sculpt, it basically makes you free to change the shape of the sculpt drastically. But if you want to keep your sculpt close to the low poly, then it doesn't matter. It all comes down to preference. But for this one, I wanted to retopologize, so I didn't mind adding the holding edges to the blockout right now. And also over here, you see I did the extrude so I can get the outside rim, and you see me going back and forth between 3 mode to make sure my holding edges were holding the shape properly. And I scaled it down a bit because the rim, when the metal rim is too thick, it also adds more weight to the shield. And I know this is all 3D and I'm talking about weight, but sometimes when you see something, you can tell that it's very heavy. So it's good to use visual cues to tell the player or anybody looking at the assets that this is not that heavy. Because if you model a great sword but then the blade is very thin and somebody sees that sword from far, they might think it's light, but then when you're telling them it's a great sword, you have to convince them in another way. Maybe there's like a very large piece in the middle of it that makes it heavy or something, but that it all comes down to visual cues, so we all get used to it. So over here I added a couple of subdivisions to the back because I wanted to get the back side to be concave, and I didn't want it to just be flat. That was me just wanting some light to slightly bounce over there, which I didn't even have to do this because in the end I painted it myself. So and over here I found out I made a mistake, and that mistake was I had a face selected while I was extruding, so it basically extruded everything, but it didn't matter. So for a block out, I've kind of added a lot of details to it because I know I'm going to be sculpting on it, so I needed it to hold the edges. But if you are following along or if you are creating your own assets, as I said already, and I can't stress this enough, you can move from this phase, just clean up the model a little bit more, polish it, and make sure everything looks right in the silhouettes, and then go in texture. Because when it comes to hand painted textures, you use the model to get the major silhouettes, the silhouettes that you can fake with painting. And after you're done, you can move straight to texturing and then paint a lot of details on it. But if you look at Blizzard workflows and League of Legends workflows for Riot Games, which like Riot Games artwork is like one of my favorite art styles, which also inspired this asset, by the way. Those, if you look at their pieces, since they work mostly with characters in League, they tend to have to create a high res, because with characters it's best to create a high resolution 2D model because it's easier to sketch it out in high resolution and then explore different shapes and see how the character looks in 3D before optimizing it down to a low resolution and then painting. But since the high res was already created, whoever is painting the texture can also bake a couple of maps out of the high resolution and paint them into the low res. So basically imagine instead of baking a normal map and using that for the final render, you can bake an ambient occlusion and paint the ambient occlusion into the base color, because in the end only the base color will be used in the final. So for now I think this is where I finished the asset. I had a block out at a point I wanted, and I know I added 2 straps to the back of the shield to give the visual of it being a shield, because adding the 2 straps at the back is what tells you that, oh, this thing is meant to be held from behind. But ultimately in the end, in the final, I remember I deleted those 2 straps. I wish I added them, but I deleted them because I didn't want them distracting from the shield, so I just deleted them, which in my opinion I still think is a bad idea. I should have kept them in, but I didn't want to go back and do it. I could go back and add them right now because I could put them just in a special UV space and quickly paint them with some details and it'll be done. That's one advantage of doing hand painted textures, because these straps are so small that I don't have to have a high resolution version of them. So from here on out, I just add the straps and I move on to ZBrush. So if you've watched the video to this part, please, any feedback is appreciated. And in the next video, I'll be moving on to the ZBrush point of this, and also the texturing, because the retopology is mostly me sitting there and just retopologizing, so that part is not that important because it comes to more of having knowledge of basic rules and like where you want your edges and how optimized you want it to be. And then the texturing is where a lot of the work comes in, because that's the final part for everything. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you for watching and have a great one.